Good morning.
Hi, Nigel. How are you doing?
I think we're all struggling, aren't we? Oh,
Just a question of keeping going, as far as
it is just actually, yeah, just keep on buggering on and relentlessly optimistic. That's what I'm telling myself. Actually, I find, funny enough, and there are a lot of things we're all doing, but I find activities like this, at least periodically having to check in to do it and then kind of make a little bit of difference and keep on thinking about the issue. They're the things that keep you motivated, because the rest of it is just so dreadful. Dealing with endless amounts of students with really challenging mental health issues in college, and there's just this whole context, which is, I'm sure it's the same in your environment as well. Just keeping people, feeling a bit optimistic in the face of so much challenge. Really.
Well, I'm retired, so I'm not involved very much in UCL stuff.
Right.
On the other hand, I'm doing homeschooling for my granddaughter at the moment to try and keep, because she's getting nothing from, she's 9, she's getting nothing from her school. The other grandchildren are okay, but she's not. Parents are working absolutely flat out.
Yep.
I mean,
yeah.
So, my daughter was working all day and then teaching in Nashville online from 2 until 10 last night. So, she doesn't have a lot of time so anything I can do to sort of pick up, give her a bit of company and so on. It's,
Well, it's a very interesting collective effort in this regard, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't know whether I've made some. I worked on a section I said I'd work on data engineering stuff, and also on the introduction, just trying to think of how this would fit together. So
is that in the Dropbox? Yes, I should look. I'm afraid I haven't.
That's all right. No, it's called Data Engineering Perspective. Yeah.
I will find it any minute. There should be more on the ball. We're number 8, aren't we? Yeah. So, yes, 28th of January. That's great. Let's just get that up. Yes, I'm hoping some other people are going to join us. But,
wow. We get. I kind of. Partly, we just do need some of the expertise from the people who are doing some of the modeling on the ground, because one makes these assumptions and you just don't know whether it's interesting. I mean, there's lots of stuff you can find. I mean, it's been quite interesting looking around at people doing the data modeling in various bits and pieces of the community. And some people kind of take the modeling really, really seriously. For other people, it's like, oh God, we just need to get this done. I've got time to generate all this bloody metadata. I just need to get the modeling done. And you can see those effects. And of course, there's a big difference, as I say in there, between the model that's the data that's generated in silico from your software systems, which is another kind of data, to the data that people are scrabbling to collect from
absolutely
the real world and real world interactions or whatever,
and trying to decide what those data really sort of represent.
Absolutely. One thing that occurred to me, I don't know the answer, I mean, is with the huge new focus on variance, and of course within host mutation and this extraordinary attempt, people said, oh God, this thing's changing. Of course it's bloody changing, but how far that's modeled and captured, and how far you can factor out, and how far you're doing that data collection in the dark is really interesting to me. It hadn't occurred to me. Of course, it's all very well in Uniprot saying here's a unique identifier for this piece of stuff we're interested in, but the damn thing's changing all the time as well. So surely interesting.
So we've got Glenn and Ben, so at least they'll be able to say a bit more about what the data are like on the ground. Just before we do though, I try to open your document and I'm getting a little message that says it's locked. That's the Data Engineering Perspective. Yeah. It's locked for editing by PC. That's you, is it? I mean, It's not
As far as
obviously
I know.
you.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I can open a read-only copy, so it's
Oh
not
yeah,
an
no,
issue.
that's because I'm probably working on it. So it's because I've got it open on my desk. So I mean,
Okay, that's fine then.
maybe that.
Yeah,
I don't
it
know.
was the PC that was throwing me slightly.
See who they think this. Yeah, well, you know what it is. You start copies of Word off, and it turns out you've inherited a document from somebody
Yes,
else that's got somebody else's
exactly.
authorship, although not in
Yeah.
this case. Yeah,
Anyway, right.
But you can at least see it. You can.
Yes, I can.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
yeah. So I was just going to say to the others that Nigel has put this new document into the Dropbox. So we were just starting. Oh, and Ben's just put one in as well.
There you go. There you go. Brilliant. Yeah, actually, this is great. Thanks. So I can, just to give a quick update. Thanks very much, Ben and Glenn and Dennis. We are the kind of core, it seems. Frank sent his apologies again, although he's kind of there, he says, to comment where he can.
Good.
I had simply, from the notes of last week, I'd taken the piece on the data engineering piece and realized as I was writing that I was writing from this kind of high-end set of FAIR principles, which is all very well, but then of course on the ground it's not quite like that. So whilst I'll want to describe what would be things to try and aspire to, it'd be really good to kind of collect the actual practice on the ground, and that extends from everything from the use of stable identifiers through to common formats through to indexed repositories of this stuff, and I think that's what I'll look to develop there. And I also, in my section, just introduced a very general, just started to describe a very general introduction, which just enumerates what the various sections hope they'll be talking about. It's likely that we might want to move the sections around because I realized that the stuff on data institutions gets in the way of us discussing models and software platforms and implementations and life cycles. So I think that's probably in the wrong place. But yeah, I think we're all kind of trying to grab time to work on this. So I appreciate that. That's there, and there's one or two things that I'd welcome comments on. Ben, do you just want to talk about what you've been doing?
Yeah, sure. So I focused on the data lifecycle, data model lifecycle dependencies. So I've taken the 4 bullet points that I think were in the original document and just written my kind of perspective on what my interpretation of those bullet points was. So the first paragraph is about the data lifecycle and the kind of interaction between data informing models and then models informing data, and how that could take place, whether it's a kind of more formal structure where there's regular interventions and regular feedback between maybe the data collectors and the modelers, or whether it should be a more fluid, agile relationship where as and when the knowledge is required to feedback between the two, and whether we should be spending time in between, presumably in between pandemics, developing those relationships and those feedback loops, rather than waiting until the pandemic occurs and then suddenly trying to form these relationships and collaborations. The second paragraph is on how we go about collecting new data and anticipating what types of data we might need. And obviously in a pandemic, we're in a very difficult position that we need a lot of data very quickly and often in very large varieties. We don't necessarily know what the next pandemic is going to be or the type of virus it's going to be. So predicting what data we might need is a particular challenge. And particularly in real time, if we're trying to then collect new data, how we go about doing that and integrating that into existing data collection protocols is quite difficult. In relation to the size and volume of data, how we go about storing data, particularly large data products, whether we should be building those infrastructures again outside of the pandemic period so that we're ready, and then again ensuring open communication between modelers and data holders in advance of needing them. Third paragraph is about the flexibility. Often these data experimental designs are quite rigid for obvious reasons of needing integrity and continuity. But that doesn't really feed in very well when you're suddenly needing data for a particular policy question. There needs to be some degree of flexibility to be able to integrate new data or collect new data. And as our knowledge of the virus improves throughout the pandemic, we may need new data and to be integrating that. And generating completely new data collection protocols from scratch is not going to happen in a quick time frame. So we're probably going to need to tap into existing data collection protocols, but then that requires the flexibility from both the modelers and from the data collectors in terms of hopefully integrating those new collection protocols or the new data that we need.
Mm.
And then finally, linkage and dependencies between data sets. So this kind of links in with new technologies that we get much higher throughput genome sequencing now. We have the new apps for contact tracing and all sorts of new technology, which is generating much larger quantities of data at higher resolution with whole new sets of modeling challenges, which we've talked about in some of the other papers. But I guess the data challenges here are kind of allowing the linkage between these different sources of data, accounting for different dependencies or granularities. Also the privacy challenges that you may well have different privacy or open access requirements for different data sets, and knowing perhaps which patients or which households or which regions are relevant in each data sets, and linking those between the different data can be really challenging when they've all got different privacy constraints on them. And yeah, I think that's pretty much summarizing everything.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jasmine, Jasmina, welcome. I see you're with us. Great to have you.
Hi, Nigel. Hi, everyone.
It's great to see you. I know we're all madly busy, so I really appreciate checking in. We're trying to do this every week, as you know, and we were just saying last week it'd be great to have your input at this point. Just to reprise where we are, we had this kind of rough outline for different perspectives of the chapter, and various were tasked for go away and try and develop it a little bit. And I've just been talking about the work he's been doing on that front, and I've done something on data engineering. But it seems a lot of this comes back down to what's happening on the ground and your experience around collating the models and the data that's going into them. What data is actually available, really. I mean, that's the key insights we really need in all of this, and just fantastic to get your perspective on some of this at this point. Yeah.
So just to say that something that is currently bothering me, if that's the right word, is why is there a smaller decrease in the Pillar 2 data, the REACT service and the ONS, than there is in the Pillar 4 data? And this is really kind of one of the critical questions, because different models currently are using different data, and that decline and where we end up on the 8th of March, if that's the day, then really will depend on that. And I think untangling that on a larger scale needs to go in that paper. So I'm currently thinking what may be the reason in the model and how we can cover for it. But it's a bigger sort of, I can write about that.
We're going to say what would be really helpful is if you could just summarize what questions are really bugging you at the moment in this space, or perplexing you, or because I think that experience on the ground would be really helpful in shaping the way we want to address the data challenge. I mean, we've got this idea of wouldn't it be wonderful if, or if we could be this more agile or this better at curating it. But the real question is often what's happening on the ground. Yeah. So just expand on that a little bit, what you were saying.
Well, so for example, we see a decline in number of cases now across all data, but there is the slope at which they are declining is different if you look at the ONS and the REACT survey data versus if you look, for example, the COVID dashboard data. So there is a much, and I have put both data sets within the mathematical model. So you do the calibration process, and in the calibration process, depending on what assumptions you make in the model, for example, susceptibility of different age groups to the new strain versus to the old strain, you will get a matching, you will get a calibration, but you'll have a different set of parameters within the model. Yeah. Some of those will be characteristics of this new strain, and this is where this conversation comes around how much more infectious it is, and is it more deadly? And I think so. These are really nitty-gritty for this day and age.
Oh, but it's hugely important.
It's something that it's very easy to sweep the parameter, and this is the issue I have as a mathematician. It's very easy to sweep the parameter space and just come up with a good set of parameters, or what good in inverted commas that works. And then if you try to fit a different one, it may work also, depending how you slice the parameter space. And the data that you use really constrains you there. Now, if you have different sets of data at different points of time, then you are further constraining yourself. But is this a continuum? So if I look at the first wave versus the second wave, should I be doing that in the calibration, or should I just calibrate the second wave? And when I do this, you get different results as a prediction for the future.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's such a sort of rich set of issues in there. Just on the first point you made, just interesting. So the data.gov, coronavirusdata.gov data that they're providing, do you use that reasonably? Do you find that a reasonably reliable? I mean, because it's engineered to quite a high standard, and actually it's published, it's quite current, it's reasonable. I say best practice, it's at least decent, but that versus the actual ONS collection survey data, are they fundamentally different methodologies?
Well, I think so if you think about, for example, just the testing data, if it includes pillar 2, which is self-testing or community testing with LTF, for example, you already thrown an unknown in the equation. So not only you have uncertainty, but you also have when you have taken the test. So a separate study which is submitted to Eurosurveillance for Austria suggests that if you do an LTF early enough, and your CD value is certain value, so it's not high enough, then you are going to get an accurate LTF and accurate RT-PCR. Right. But they become divergent if your duration of symptoms is, for example, longer, or you have a higher CD value, which would suggest you've come too late for testing.
Okay.
And that's one of the differences, for example.
And can I just on this issue that, I'm sorry, I don't need to talk about well, we need to talk about the domain, don't we? I just find it fascinating. The emergence of new variants. I mean, of course, so there's how many R values are there for these different variants? How you back infer what the distribution are, unless you have, good estimators from I guess you are from the PCR data that's coming in. You've got some notion of what the prevalence is. But I think it's just interesting to know how the modelers are always having to kind of catch up with the fact there might be another variant or another variant. And it's really whack-a-mole, isn't it?
I mean, it's difficult. And as I say to people who ask me this, we make an informed assumption in the model. And the informed assumption in the model is that you have a certain number of variants present at one point, and they compete against each other, and one wins. And that is clearly evident from when we compare what proportion of tested values are from B117, or which one are from the original SARS, which are from the Brazilian, and so on. And the way that I put that in the model is by having a logistic curve with a certain growth rate and reaching certain proportion at certain time. So, as more data became, as we did this in December, you made certain different assumptions to if you make that now. And then once you've made that assumption of a logistic S-shaped growth curve for this second strain, for example, then you can calculate what the inferred IFR or CFR is from the model.
Yeah, excellent. So, and do we know?
So I don't know how much of this we want to put in, because this
Well,
is really nitty-gritty.
what we're looking for is, I think, great illustrations of where the challenge of modeling actually is off the back of the data assumptions you can and can't make. Or, you know, I mean, there is reference in the modeling and estimation chapters I was looking at. Of course, you know, a challenge is this whole issue of within host variation, and you know, we're seeing it kind of come out now, and the speed with which the strain can change, and you know, we're living that with that reality in a really interesting way. And I guess the question there is how good is our testing to notice how much of variant X, Y, and Z there is. I mean, I don't know how quickly. I don't know what the data, I mean, so is the data in the PCR tests quite comprehensive, quite complete? Do we know? I mean, sorry, Valerie, yeah. Oh, is that, I thought you had your hand up, sorry. No, it's not, no, you didn't, it's me, misreading the gallery.
No, I mean, what I think we have good capability of doing is genomically identify the different strains, and this is why we could do it. Early on, and I think that aspect is important because we can almost keep tab of what is in circulation and try to then untangle. I mean, there is this question around, you know, different ages may be affected by different strains, and I don't think we know enough about that to say clearly.
But for example, so we were looking at this week whether we should try and use some of the strain data and you know, so we haven't actually done anything with it yet, but the questions that come out immediately are, first of all, it seems, you know, the genetic data is only really available for a limited set of samples, and then the big question then is, well, how biased are those samples? Where, you know, why have they been done? It seems like they're probably biased more towards, Jasmina probably knows better than me, but biased more towards old people's homes, and at least in Scotland that appears to be the case. And but there's all sorts of uncertainty about how you even, you know, even when you get this extra level of data, it's not uniform.
No. I mean, but that's a great learning point. So that's a great illustration of why this is hard. I mean, you know, we haven't got all the answers in this. I think the whole point about the chapter is to illustrate that whilst there may be these high-end principles, reality on the ground is really challenging. And to leaven the chapter with examples of just the sort Jasmina was putting up there, and you've just described there, is that, you know, everybody's aware that there is these different variants, but how do we factor them into our models, and what data would we ideally like, and is the PCR data, you know, good enough resolution to tell us anything over and above something like a base frequency or something? You know, there's all those issues, aren't there? Yeah, really.
But I think, Nigel, that all has to be caveated that we may not want the same data set at every step of the pandemic, or in different places, or for basic, I mean, if we are, for example, looking at reopening schools now, we want to understand a subset from the data that we have around how much will schools be driving on transmission from 8th of March onwards.
So somehow our data challenges have to be as rigorous as they can be on the one hand to curate and have high quality data, but as agile as they can be to face these constantly evolving questions. One thing we discussed last week, it'd be really neat to try and produce a taxonomy or a framework of the types of questions that are being posed routinely. What are you always being asked as the modeler? You know, and as you say, it's everything from MPIs, airports or schools, or regions and airports, or regions and schools, or age segmentation. I mean, you know, the range of questions. Is there any place where that question set, that is actually formalized or written down, made explicit?
I can look into finding something.
That would be great. I mean, that would be very helpful, just as I think as an aid really for helping structurists. But anything that you can do to provide a bit of insight. Yeah.
I do have a list of questions I've been asked myself, but I'm not sure how much publicly that available is. So I'll just look into that and
it's really just to help shape the way we lay out the data challenge in a way, and just the way you have. And I think you know, we're not going to have, I don't know, Dennis's view, this isn't a chapter in a publication that has all the answers. It's as much about, you know, this is tough and we need to kind of be agile
But
about.
we could,
I mean,
we could easily produce that framework by thinking through what was important as we moved through the different seasons or stages of the pandemic last year. So the first question was, do we need NPIs in lockdown? Then how do we relax them, I guess? And then it was around how we deal with the second strain. And now again, how do we relax in presence of multiple strains? I mean, those 4 points need A, different data, B, different skills, and C, don't always have the right answer.
So Glenn, you were, yeah.
I was just going to say that one thing that strikes me that might be a good sort of principle to sort of suggest that could be carried forward is that given that we've got this very adaptive data collection, which is driven by all sorts of policy questions and sort of emergency response, really, we're never going to get these nice data sets that a statistician would like. But one thing we might try and push for is for when this data is being collected, for the denominator population to be well characterized so that we understand better where the effort has gone, so we could potentially build approaches that would account for that, you know, biases in the data.
Yeah, it's this kind of old idea in a way that your best opportunity is at the point of capture, and often a lot of really crucial metadata is just lost at that point. And we kind of know it now in physics, where, I mean, physics, you know, large particle accelerators, you know, make this, I mean, you have a lot of data, but it doesn't have many attributes, you know, whereas the challenge for us is that there are lots of potential attributes as well. But at the point of generation, and I guess this is what's quite interesting about things like automatic PCR. I mean, there'd be tons of metadata about the instrument, the possibly about the subject, and possibly about the output. But I mean, that will vary in different testing regimes and collection regimes, and because the more you capture, you might then have an opportunity to ask the unanticipated question of the data later on. I mean, it's that kind of trade-off, isn't it? Yeah, really interesting. So that question framework, Jasmina, would be brilliant. And anything you can throw over the fence to us about what the modeling data trade-offs have been and where the successes have been, and also where the kind of toe bruising has happened. You know, like one of the things that the Delve report banged on about was this, what they call their happenstance data, you know, this stuff on, wouldn't it be nice if we could use mobile telco data or economic transaction data or other bits and pieces, which had not been collected with ever a view that it would be used in a context like this. But, you know, and so hasn't been necessarily collected to any set of common standards. But of course, in future, I mean, this kind of mobility data or contact matrix data is going to be crucial, right? And now is the opportunity to be doing a bit more to curate and manage the collection of that stuff.
I think it goes back to the point that Ben made, which I agree with, is this work, sort of groundwork, if you want, between epidemics, between pandemics, where we are sort of all bearing our head and doing the work that we want to do, but coming collectively and doing it, this, you know, working together to find out what data is needed, what would you like, and that might be different requirements for different skill sets. So if you have an agent-based model, you need a much more rich data set than if you have a simple comparamental model, which you can fit and produce projections in a very feasible way, where they will give you a binary outcome at the end of the day. And I think that's important. And then the second thing to consider is making, I guess one way we could suggest this is where you have this, and I mentioned this before, sort of data lakes, which the Turing Institute is doing quite a lot now, where and the Open Safely, for example. So they have data set that they wish to share and they wish people to use for the purposes in a collaborative way, but also for them to understand what else can they do, can they collect that would be useful to the modelers. And I can write about that, but it might actually be quite useful to have somebody like Ben Gold
Yeah,
Acre, I think it's-
Ben, we've got lined up for this. In fact, I'm on his data governance board for Open Safely, so I chair that. So I got good
Okay.
access to that. But I think it's
Okay.
that's a great example. I'm less familiar with where the successes have been in the Turing Institute's data.
I mean, they are trying to do it. I don't think so. There's been some sharing of data with the electronic health records and things like that. They're trying to build data lakes, but with, so for example, Institute of Health Informatics in UCL. But I'm not in it to sort of know the details fully. But there was a workshop which I took part where we were discussing how to go forward. And sort of an information will come from that is not publicly yet, but it may be by the time we have this document, so we can refer to it.
Could I just ask you a general question? That really interesting point you made about this big difference between, say, an agent-based simulation, where I can imagine throwing more and more, information about presumed social rules or interaction rules, and then somehow it all comes out in the emergent kind of simulation, versus if you like, the equation, the compartmental models, the other classes of model which seek a different, if you like, equation-driven approach. I mean, are those the two major candidates in town at the moment? Are we? Yeah.
Together with branching processes models, which are basically tree-like structures, which are used mostly to capture your R by looking at how many secondary, tertiary infections you get. So I think my understanding is that those three are the sort of the key aspects. And then you get close to sort of a very simple agent-based model can be very close to a very stratified and granulated SEIR model. So you get sort of somewhere in the border between the two, depending on what you have. And in theory, they should give bulk same results based on the same assumptions. And this is something I'm trying to do within a different post, sort of test this hypothesis that if you run X number of models that are intrinsically different, but with the same assumptions and data set, you will get a result that is collectively similar.
So if we were to take an example, again, looking for examples of where data is not necessarily collected through a testing regime or an ONS. So one of the questions is the whole contact matrix question about, what do we actually know about how individuals in care homes interact as opposed to people working in this sector, people in the food industry versus people in schools, et cetera, et cetera. The data for that is, again, a class of happenstance data. You might be able to get it or infer it from all sorts of different places. But have you, I guess, when you look for abstractions over that data, very general abstractions for certain classes of models, and you can quite carefully model it in the agent-based simulation models.
Yeah. So you can. So the obvious data sets are the Polymod data set, and then the more recently this pandemics data set that was collated by Julia. I think Julia was involved in that with the London School, and there are differences between them. The Polymod was then expanded across, I don't remember how many, but a large number of countries. Mark Jitt led this analysis. And so we have in theory contact matrix from some years ago, which tells us about the interaction of different age groups within different settings. Yeah. Now, when we are modeling this in a pandemic, we use that as the C value, the number of contacts, and then we stratify it as much as we want, i.e. in bands of 10 years, 5 years per year, I think. And then you think about that. Now, that changes in terms of behavior of people when they are when they are being told not to mix, and when they are not obeying the rules, and then when they're isolating, and then when they are not adhering to isolation. And I think it would be good to have a repeated Polymod study, when we get to a stage of what we call kind of the first pandemic wave has finished and the second wave was starting. So October was such an environment. So if we were to look at how people were interacting in October, we could get a picture of, you know, what people are thinking when we are out.
That's a great example. That's a great example. And just populating the chapter with a few examples like that, where you can do this anticipatory, if you like, almost citizen science data collection, where you just like to know how behaviors were shaped or what that might look like. So I mean,
I'm
I
making
guess
some notes, and I apologize. The noise you may hear is my laptop running simulations. It's complaining.
There you go. So if there was a way of just enumerating some of the insights you've got from the modeling data requirement for us, that'd be great. I mean, I just throw any of those observations over the fact that'd be fantastic. Glenn, the other stuff that we talked about, the platform and the software tooling a little bit last week.
Yeah, so I did speak to some people over the week, and they're unfortunately they were all quite interested. They're all quite tied up. So Richard Reeve, for example, is quite keen, but he said he wouldn't really be available until the second week in February.
Right.
So I tried to encourage him and the others to maybe just jot down something.
I think jotting down some of the big features of their kind of concerns in this space at the moment, we can rehydrate this if we get the kind of basic nuggets. I think a lot of us, it's just making sure we don't go down too many, cul-de-sacs, really. Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get anything from them this week, but I didn't also hassle them very much. I contacted them on Friday.
But I mean, do you have a sense of what those issues might be, just from where you're sitting, looking across?
So I mean, in terms of the, so there's one of the interests is in terms of traceability of data, and so looking at when data changes or whether there's an issue flagged with data to sort of have traceability between sort of model outputs and the data that's used to construct them. So that's partly about transparency and sort of identifying issues early on. So there aren't kind of constants buried in some piece of code, I guess, is the sort of
that issue of provenance and when the assumptions change. I mean, one thing again I was struck by in the Delve report was, of course, and we all know it, don't we? When you're in an exponential situation like a pandemic, the time to do the kind of careful, studied description of your assumptions and the data or how they might change. I mean, that stuff needs, as far as possible, to be kind of machine generated, but of course, again, a lot of the software does not support that in and of itself. It's not the bit of work that people have often put into.
So I guess the project is to, and the sort of goal is to try and develop those kind of tools so that they would be available and be relatively easy to use. And also add value to the modelers, so it becomes something that people want to use.
I mean, I think what would be really helpful is if you could just enumerate the kind of major bullets, what the desirables are, why it matters. I mean, again, I don't know. Sometimes the quickest thing to do is to kind of jettison models of yore and just start again because things gotten so complicated. But again, what Jasmine was saying was very interesting in that sense of, had you got a moment to pause and put some different estimators in at a moment when there's time there to collect the data, again capturing all of that at the point at which data collection.
And then I guess the other part of it links to what we were talking about, which is probably much your kind of interests overlaps with your interest a lot, which is like how you describe the data so that people understand what's there and what the limits to using it might be.
And I guess that's where the effect that the modelers intercept other interests in the scientific community. I mean, there's a lot of course, the genomics community have put a lot of work into controlled vocabularies, and you see that in the work they do on protein databases and the rest of it. And again, you know, where that becomes a material read over to the kind of general modeling of transmission and infection. You know, you can't import the whole world. What bit of that world is useful? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, you know, one of the issues maybe is that in genomics, well, one, it's got a longer track record, but it's also perhaps slightly more controlled.
Yeah.
And limited, whereas, you know, as we've just been, you know, hearing from Jasmina, all sorts of things that impinge on this kind of the sort of data that you would want for modeling pandemics. So it's much harder to come up with a schema for it.
And following on from that, I think it's also important for validation of models as well. If you're using data as a tool for validating, say, multiple models, then knowing why some models work better on that data, you have a much better chance of understanding that, or understanding which model you have more confidence in if you know where the data have come from, and you then can kind of get an idea about what the deficiencies in the model are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've used that as a way of kind of comparing models against each other, is using simulated data from one model to try and calibrate another one or test another model.
Do we have good accessible examples of that? That's the.
Well, I'd say the
yeah.
SCRC that Glenn and I have been working with. I know Richard, again, you know, relying on him contribute to that, but he's worked a lot on developing these kind of validation strategies as part of the open.
I think the point, and again, the question in here is, I think it's persuading the practitioners that the investment in the data maintenance and curation is sufficient, has a sufficiently valuable payoff. And I think that comes down to this whole issue about aligning incentives as well. You know, do people in all the other things they've got to do, does this get them any?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the incentives, I guess, is if you can set up these kind of systems, which are probably links to Ben Goldacre's approach, which is to set up tools that actually are useful to the modelers, and providing access to the data through them, I guess, is obviously it's a big issue for modeling. And so, you know, that's an obvious route to sort of get some leverage to say, well, you know, if you want access to the data, then you need to do it through this route, and that would give you this sort of traceability.
Dennis, you've been listening, and I think you listen into a lot of these. Do you listen into all of them?
I try to, yes. I'm being a spectator on this one at the moment. I suppose I'm most interested in the surveillance thing, and I see you'd got a little draft of 8.7, I think you call it. About.
Yeah, literally just
picking up on the independent, the WHO independent panel, and I mean, see, I thought that what you've written there seemed very sensible. I don't know whether we can go beyond that. I mean, I don't.
No, absolutely. I mean, the question is, what do we know about kind of trying to set up the conditions for the most effective collation and collection across this distributed information space, to kind of get a sense of where stuff is changing. I suppose, I don't know. I mean, how widespread PCR is going to be, or I mean, a lot of countries seem to have some capability for genomics more advanced than others, but I've no idea what the situation on the ground is, to the extent that these kinds of abilities to notice changes or notice anything happening is becoming kind of commoditized to a thing you can plug in the side of a piece. I don't know. Yeah,
I suppose. I mean, that seems a sort of role for WHO, which should be achievable given the background of the current pandemic, that to set up a program of genetic monitoring with an emphasis on areas where you think are more likely than others to bring up a new disease. So, yeah, that's.
I guess the general picture is.
Otherwise, I mean, I think the question. I mean, it's. I mean, there's a reconciliation of sort of being transparent and respecting privacy, I suppose. But from an information point of view, it would be ideal if the kind of monitoring, if there were a whole lot of different kinds of monitoring going on, and anyone who wanted to could write their own, AI type, Bayesian type program to give alerts. And and the point about such things is you don't have to act on an alert. When someone comes up with an alert that if you or I have got a research group and we've done a new data analysis program, and we come up saying we think there's a suspicious pattern, the same kind of thing has cropped up in Australia and Wuhan or wherever, then all it matters is that you can get it to who, and they have to look into it. So because I think one of the problems with setting up something which is just run as an official monitoring program is it'll probably be absolutely state of the art when it's done, but 5 or 10 years later, there'll be new ideas that it isn't taking into account. So I think getting a really good surveillance program, one of the challenges would be to reconcile transparency and privacy.
Yeah.
So obviously one challenge is to get the right kind of monitoring, but then the second case is how do you reconcile making that data, which may well have privacy aspects to it, available so that you can have flexible and up to the minute analysis of it. But I mean, my other comment about section 8.7 was I wonder if it couldn't be slotted in as 8.1, just to get the sort of logical order right. Though I mean the alternative, if you think in ways, if you think from a sort of data approach, it sort of makes sense to come at the end. I think it ought to be flagged up at the beginning at least to.
No, I think that would be the intent. I think probably. Look, I think we might move some of the sections around. In truth, Dennis, but there needs to be signposting towards it in any.
I mean, you could have an I mean, I think it's important to show that you're tackling real problems. That let's say that the introduction at least does it in a sort of, gives a sort of backbone of related to stages of the pandemic. I mean, this surveillance we're talking about, but also Jasmina was saying that when you come onto interventions, that there are sort of stages to consider. If what that is pointing to is sections 8.1 to 8.7 written in a totally different order, because that makes logical sense, that's absolutely fine as long as it's flagged up.
Yeah.
So it's a simple point. So.
Okay, no, that's great. That's great.
To what extent do we have to say something? I was just having a quick look through. I mean, Dennis was just talking about WHO and so on, whereas a lot of what we've been talking about is more national policies. And so at some point we perhaps need to, I mean, many of the issues are the same, and yet what's realistically achievable is going to be different, whether we're talking about national or international. And I wasn't quite sure where that came up in this document at the moment.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, I think it'll get some brief airtime in the policy, data and policy discussion. But I mean, and there's a chapter on the general policy challenges, aren't there? But I mean, that variation, and we've already seen it, haven't we? Even within the UK, the devolved administrations, different statistical authorities, different geospatial authorities. It's all, in a sense, we are in a data sense a bit more disunited than we were 15 years ago. In some respects, in others, we're doing a lot better. But I think it's an interesting challenge. Yeah.
The thing is, that has both positive and negative aspects, doesn't it? I mean, it can, the extreme negative one, it can have, we've got data for our own monitoring, but we're not going to share it, or just more neutrally, just we absolutely refuse to gather that kind of data for whatever reasons we have for refusing to gather it. But in the, I don't know whether it's possible. What I should be encouraging is countries to compete in a sort of collaborative way, sort of setting good examples. And I think to stray on to possibly an appropriate comparison, I always felt that one of the things that was good about the EU, and I'm thinking things like environmental policy, was that a whole lot of countries typically got together to discuss things like, I don't know, let's say whether to have bird reserves or something. And somehow, although none of those individual countries particularly wanted to set up bird reserves, they somehow got into a room where they found themselves deciding that it was appropriate to have an EU rule saying that everyone needed to devote at least 5% of their land area to bird reserves or something like that. And in other words, you've got cooperative rules emerging that were doing better than any of the individual partners would probably have done on their own, or where perhaps only one or two of partners would. I mean, again, one of the sad things I think about leaving the EU was that actually the UK was quite good at some cases at proposing these, why don't we all do this?
Indeed it was. And I think...
And I'm just thinking in terms of, so perhaps this is something more for the policy paper, but that the kind of international collaboration one's going to set up, and obviously for data would be an important part of this, does, if at all possible, want to be set up in a way that encourages countries to sort of set competitive examples of good practice. So
yes, indeed, yes, and I think
maybe we just want a discussion of the, we should have some kind of discussion of the pros and cons of international differences.
Could go in the introduction if nowhere else. A paragraph there might fit. Or,
I mean,
or in a discussion at the end.
Right at the moment around vaccine availability and what did the actual contracts say, and there's a whole in my world of open data, there's a whole kind of argument around open contracting for publicly procured services. So, not always very popular with either industry or politicians, you can imagine. But so the issues about what people do or don't agree on about what procurement should be made available or what data about resources could be made available, those have sometimes worked very well in other cognate areas. I mean, they absolutely have. Okay, look, I've got an 11 o'clock. I'm conscious of the fact that it's been a good discussion. Thank you. And I'm conscious of the fact that Jasmina's contribution has been really valuable. So any rough write-up, I mean, literally as bullet points of the stuff we should be paying attention to that reprises some of the conversation today would be brilliant.
I'm just drafting it as we spoke. But at the moment, only I can understand what it says. So
that's all right. No, that's fantastic. And look, I mean, it's partly the effort after meaning is that we come together each week as far as we can and just trying to make sense of what we've been cogitating about. And I mean, and we won't get access to all the people or all the information we need, which is why I think, Glenn, in your case, they can't get hold of to Richard's stuff. I mean, just enough of it to be able to outline the major.
I did intend to do that and then pass it to them.
I know enough of what Ben is doing to write.
Thanks, Glenn.
Yeah. And I think to Dennis's point about reordering some of this, I think that we may well end up look at this at some point and realize it could do with a bit of refactoring. I mean, Ben, I think what you've got is really great in terms of, again, I think if we can leaven it with concrete examples that point out to where this has become the issue and not overcomplicated it. I think again, Jasmina's point about at various points in the modeling, there's been a reset moment or a moment when the models have got a different set of questions posed to them. So there's had to be a rethink about what data. Because the knowledge engineer will want things to be nice and tidy around the edges. The chief data officer may well want that, but practice is that you've just spent a bunch of time investing in one set of collection and realized there's another set of questions you've got to answer. I'm fascinated by this difference between coronavirusdata.gov.uk and React. I mean, there may be something there that's interesting. I mean, we do know, don't we, that in few areas, that there are divergences between what the answer appears to be, and sometimes that's for obvious reasons like lag, or sometimes it goes to something more interesting, about the method.
We don't want anyone we don't have anybody from the Imperial group in the INI, do we, Valerie, Dennis?
Oh, we must have, in general. We certainly asked many of them. I'm trying to think who's actually been involved very much. Early on, we certainly had quite a few.
Because if I'm just wondering
there are
if
quite a
we,
few from this, perhaps we've got more from the School of Hygiene have been more involved than from Imperial.
I think maybe I maybe not yet, but at some point, I mean, we know enough from the description to understand what React is and what it does, but we could always ask Steve Riley or his group to sort of look over it and then think. And it may be that, you know, I mean, as you said, we didn't mention lag, but lag is an issue, and the behavior around the Christmas holidays is an issue. So we kind of needed to almost straighten the curve there to understand what had happened then, rather than just making assumptions. So anyway, so I'm going to. So it's my job for next week to make a list of bulletin points around application of data in real-time modeling pandemics.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. And where you've had kind of data gap or data quality issues in what you've been doing and thought, well, if only we'd known this, wouldn't that be great? Or this isn't just up to the level of detail one would wish or like. I think the more practical examples there are, the more compelling it will be as well in the context of this. And
I mean, there is this issue that, like, I had lots of questions, and then I wrote a technical document. By the time I had written the technical document, the question wasn't of interest anymore. Couldn't really do anything with it. So I've got like 5 or 6 papers that I wrote.
But there's the question timeline. That'd be a great source to look at and say, well, you know, that's the challenge for modeling on the ground. This is likely not to be any different in the future either. Yeah.
Can I just say, are we taking a UK-centric approach here, or is experience in other countries?
Well, you know what? I think we know our own quite well, but where you can find compelling examples or better examples, and of course, to Dennis's point, the surveillance piece has got to be kind of.
I mean, if you want a compelling evidence, we could mention, so the model that I work with, Covasim, is used in Australia and in America widely, and so we can back it up with that if you want. But then it's again one model, one example. I don't know.
We're working with models in both Venezuela and Bangladesh at the moment, and talking with people from Ecuador, Madagascar. So there are examples there that could feed in, but I just wanted to check if that was kind of relevant to what we were talking about over the.
But
Valerie, Dennis,
sorry.
I was going to ask you to answer.
I was only going to say, but presumably it's the data more than the models.
Yes, I was reading that.
That's true. But there's this deep kind of interpenetration of the two, and for some people, the models are another class of data we have to remember to curate and annotate properly. And I think that's actually, if we don't talk about the challenge of the curation of the models and the metadata associated, probably nobody will. I mean, it can only be a passing comment, but it needs to be there. What I'd like us to do for next week is just to carry on enriching the various structure points we've got with observations, where Glenn and Ben could work on the life cycle and the modeling, and Jasmina, your questions and insights will be hugely valuable. We've got a list of 1 or 2 people to try and get along. I'm, as I say, Neil and Ben, I mean, Ben in particular, I've got a good, whether he'll have the time to write it, but I've got enough material from what's going on in Open Safety to be able to, I think, put the principles in place. Yeah.
Can I ask you, should I do this as a separate standalone document or add it to some document already there?
Why don't you do it as a separate document for now, and then we will know, because I think it will have relevance to a number of the bits of the decomposition of the chapter we currently have. Is that okay? Would that be?
Yeah. Okay. Good. Brilliant. I like when it's a clear thing I have to do.
Yeah. Good. Well, I appreciate your contribution there, and let us try and convene next week, same time, and we'll make steady progress step by step. Thank you so much. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, nice
Thank
to
you very
see you
much,
all.
Nigel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.